The morning mist clung to the mountains of Eastern Europe like a gray blanket, hiding the movements of both armies positioned on opposite sides of the valley. It was October 1943, and the war had been raging for years. In a small village that had changed hands between opposing forces 3 times in the past month, a young woman named Elena Petrov crouched behind the ruins of what used to be the local church. Elena was 24 years old, with sharp green eyes that could spot movement from incredible distances. Her hands, though small and delicate-looking, were steady as steel. She had grown up hunting with her father in these very mountains, learning to shoot before she could properly read. What started as a way to put food on the table during hard times had transformed her into something the enemy would soon learn to fear. The village below was strategically important. It sat at the crossroads of 2 major supply routes, and whoever controlled it could dictate the flow of weapons, food, and reinforcements to the front lines. For the past 2 weeks, Elena had been part of a small resistance group that had been picking off enemy patrols and disrupting their operations. But today was different. Today, intelligence reports suggested that 3 high-ranking enemy generals would be meeting in the village to plan a major offensive. Elena adjusted her rifle, a modified hunting weapon her father had left her. It wasn't the most advanced sniper rifle, but she knew every bolt, spring, and trigger mechanism by heart. She had painted it with mud and wrapped it in cloth to prevent any glint of metal from giving away her position. Her ghillie suit, hand-sewn from local vegetation, made her practically invisible against the rocky outcrop where she lay. The resistance leader, a grizzled man named Victor who had fought in the previous war, had initially been skeptical about including a woman in their operations. That skepticism had vanished after Elena's first mission, where she had taken out an enemy machine gun nest from 800 meters away with 3 consecutive shots. Now, Victor trusted her judgment completely, and when she said she could make the shots that would change everything, he believed her. As the sun began to rise higher, Elena studied the village through her scope. She had memorized every building, every window, every possible hiding spot over the past week. The enemy had set up their temporary headquarters in the old town hall, a sturdy stone building that offered good protection but also limited escape routes. Intelligence suggested the meeting would take place on the 2nd floor, in a room with large windows facing east to catch the morning light. Elena's stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had eaten only a piece of stale bread and some dried meat the night before. Food was scarce, and the resistance fighters often went hungry to ensure their limited supplies lasted. But hunger was nothing new to Elena. She had learned to ignore discomfort, to focus only on the task at hand. Her breathing was controlled and steady, her heartbeat slow and regular. The first signs of activity came around 9 in the morning. A convoy of 3 black cars rolled into the village square, escorted by 2 motorcycles and a small truck full of soldiers. Elena watched through her scope as the vehicles stopped in front of the town hall. Men in crisp uniforms began stepping out, their polished boots clicking on the cobblestones. Even from her distant position, she could see the glint of medals and insignia on their chests. General Heinrich von Stoltz was the first to emerge from the lead car. Elena recognized him from the photographs Victor had shown her. He was tall and imposing, with silver hair and a scar running down the left side of his face from an old battle wound. Von Stoltz was known for his tactical brilliance and his ruthlessness. Under his command, entire villages had been destroyed, and thousands of civilians had been executed for suspected resistance activities. The second general, Colonel Mikhail Volkov, stepped out of the middle car. He was shorter than von Stoltz, but broader, with thick arms and a perpetual scowl. Volkov commanded the artillery units and was responsible for the devastating bombardments that had flattened 3 nearby towns. His reputation for cruelty was matched only by his effectiveness in destroying enemy positions. The third man, General Antonio Rossi, emerged last. He was younger than the other 2, perhaps in his early 40s, but his reputation was already legendary. Rossi commanded the elite Special Forces units and was known for his innovative tactics and his ability to turn impossible situations into victories. He walked with a slight limp from a wound received in a recent battle, but his eyes were alert and constantly scanning for threats. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly as she watched the three men enter the building. These were not ordinary soldiers or even typical officers. These were the architects of countless atrocities, the masterminds behind military operations that had cost thousands of lives. The intelligence reports suggested they were meeting to plan a massive winter offensive that could extend the war by years and result in unimaginable casualties. As the generals disappeared inside the building, Elena began her final preparations. She checked the wind direction by observing the movement of smoke from a small fire in the village square. The wind was light and steady, coming from the southwest at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. She calculated the distance to the target building as approximately 750 meters, well within her effective range. Elena opened a small notebook where she had recorded detailed information about each target. Von Stoltz typically stood near windows when reviewing maps, a habit that had been observed by resistance fighters in other locations. Volkov was known to pace while talking, making him a more challenging target, but predictable in his movements. Rossi was the most cautious of the three, often staying away from windows, but intelligence suggested he had a habit of checking his pocket watch every few minutes and would position himself where he could see the clock tower in the village square. The morning sun was now high enough to clearly illuminate the second-floor windows of the town hall. Elena could see shadows moving inside, and occasionally a figure would pass by one of the windows. She forced herself to remain patient, knowing that rushing would only lead to failure. The opportunity would come, and when it did, she would be ready. Around 10:30, Elena saw movement in the eastern window of the second floor. A figure appeared, studying what looked like a large map spread on a table. Even through the scope, she could make out the distinctive silver hair and facial scar of General von Stoltz. He was exactly where intelligence had predicted he would be, examining tactical maps in the good morning light. Elena adjusted her breathing, slowing it to match her heartbeat. She had learned this technique from her father during their hunting expeditions. The key was to fire during the natural pause between heartbeats, when the body was completely still. She placed her finger gently on the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without actually firing. But something made her pause. Another figure had moved into view in the window, partially blocking her shot at von Stoltz. It was a young soldier, probably an aide or communications officer, holding a stack of papers. Elena waited, knowing that patience was often the difference between success and failure. The young man moved away after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Von Stoltz was still there, still studying the maps. Elena could see him clearly now through her scope, his profile sharp against the white wall behind him. She estimated the shot at 754 meters, accounting for the slight elevation difference between her position and the target. The bullet would need to travel for approximately 1 second, and she would need to lead the target slightly if he was moving. Elena began to apply pressure to the trigger, her breathing shallow and controlled. This was it, the first shot that would begin to change the course of history. Her father had taught her that every shot carried responsibility, that a true marksman never fired without being certain of both the target and the consequences. Today, Elena was certain of both. The sound of the rifle shot echoed across the valley like thunder, breaking the morning silence and announcing to both armies that something significant had just happened. In that moment, Elena Petrov began her transformation from a village hunter into a legend whose actions would be remembered for generations. General Heinrich von Stoltz never heard the shot that killed him. One moment he was studying the tactical map, showing his planned winter offensive, tracing supply routes with his finger and calculating troop movements, and the next moment Elena's bullet found its mark with devastating precision. The shot struck him in the center of his forehead, and he collapsed instantly onto the map he had been studying, his blood slowly spreading across the paper plans that would now never be implemented. The chaos that followed was immediate and intense. The young aide who had been standing nearby screamed and dove for cover behind an overturned desk. Shouts erupted from throughout the building as soldiers realized they were under sniper attack. Within seconds, the carefully planned meeting had dissolved into panic and confusion. General Volkov, who had been pacing near the western window when the shot rang out, immediately dropped to the floor and began barking orders. His experience in combat situations kicked in automatically, and he started coordinating the response even as his mind processed the shock of watching his colleague die instantly. General Rossi, true to his reputation for caution, had been standing away from the windows and quickly moved to take command of the situation. Elena watched the commotion through her scope, already preparing for her next shot. She had anticipated that the first kill would create confusion, and she intended to use that confusion to her advantage. The enemy soldiers were now scrambling to locate her position, but she had chosen her hiding spot carefully. The rocky outcrop provided excellent concealment, and the angle made it nearly impossible to spot the muzzle flash from the village below. Through her scope, Elena could see soldiers rushing through the building. Some were attempting to help the fallen general, though it was clear even from her distant position that von Stoltz was beyond help. Others were securing the remaining generals and trying to move them away from the windows. Elena knew she had only minutes before they would relocate the meeting to a more secure location, possibly underground, where she would have no shot at all. Colonel Volkov was now shouting orders from his position near the floor. Elena could see him gesturing toward the windows, probably organizing his men to identify her location and return fire. Volkov was a veteran of many battles, and his military training was evident in how quickly he had adapted to the sniper threat. But his experience also made him predictable in certain ways. Elena had studied reports of Volkov's behavior in previous combat situations. He was known to take personal command when under fire, moving from position to position to assess the situation and coordinate his troops. Intelligence suggested he had a habit of exposing himself briefly to get a better view of the battlefield, believing that his experience and instincts would keep him safe. The second-floor room had 3 windows facing east toward Elena's position. The center window, where von Stoltz had been killed, was now avoided by everyone in the room. But the southern window still offered a partial view of the room's interior, and Elena suspected that Volkov would eventually use it to try to spot her location. As she watched, several soldiers moved to the windows and began scanning the mountainside with binoculars. They were looking in roughly the right direction, but Elena's camouflage and positioning made her nearly invisible. She remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing and waiting for her opportunity. Movement would give away her position faster than anything else, so she had learned to become like a stone when necessary. 10 minutes after the first shot, Elena saw what she had been waiting for. A figure appeared briefly at the southern window, staying low but clearly trying to observe the mountainside. Even from 750 meters away, Elena could recognize the distinctive broad shoulders and thick build of Colonel Volkov. He was being cautious, exposing himself for only a few seconds at a time, but Elena had anticipated this behavior. She had already calculated the slight difference in angle for the southern window. The distance was virtually the same, but the wind had shifted slightly since her first shot. Elena wet her finger and held it up briefly to gauge the wind direction. It was now coming more directly from the west, which would push her bullet slightly to the right. She adjusted her aim accordingly. Volkov appeared again at the window, this time holding binoculars and scanning the mountainside systematically. Elena could see him through her scope, his face intense with concentration as he searched for any sign of the sniper who had killed his colleague. His scan pattern was methodical, moving from left to right across the landscape. Elena waited until Volkov's binoculars were pointed away from her position, then began her breathing routine. She had learned that the best snipers developed a rhythm, a sequence of actions that became automatic under pressure. Breathe in slowly, breathe out halfway, hold, aim, and fired during the natural pause between heartbeats. Volkov shifted position slightly, moving to get a better angle through the window. For just a moment, his head and shoulders were clearly visible in Elena's scope. The shot was more challenging than the first one because Volkov was partially concealed behind the window frame, but Elena had practiced shooting at partially hidden targets during her hunting days. A deer behind a tree presented similar challenges. The second shot rang out across the valley exactly 18 minutes after the first. Elena's bullet shattered the window glass and found its target with the same deadly precision as before. Colonel Volkov dropped his binoculars and collapsed backward into the room. His military experience and caution had not been enough to save him from Elena's marksmanship. The reaction to the second shot was even more intense than the first. Elena could hear shouting and confusion from the village below, even at her considerable distance. Soldiers were now running in all directions, some taking cover, others attempting to set up defensive positions. She could see muzzle flashes as some soldiers began firing randomly at the mountainside, hoping to either hit the sniper or force her to reveal her position. But Elena remained calm and focused. She had expected this reaction and had planned accordingly. Her position was well outside the effective range of the weapons the soldiers were firing, and their random shots were more likely to give away their positions than to threaten her. She had 2 shots fired and 2 targets eliminated. 1 remained. General Antonio Rossi was now the only surviving target, and Elena knew he would be the most challenging. Unlike his colleagues, Rossi had built his reputation on innovation and adaptability. He would not repeat the mistakes that had gotten the other 2 killed. Elena could see through her scope that the room was now being evacuated. Figures were moving quickly away from all the windows, and she suspected they were preparing to move Rossi to a more secure location. But Elena had one advantage that Rossi might not have considered. In her week of observation, she had noticed that the old town hall had only 2 viable exits: the main entrance facing the square and a rear door that opened onto a narrow alley. If Rossi was evacuating the building, he would have to use one of those exits, and both offer potential shot opportunities. Elena began adjusting her position slightly, preparing to engage targets at ground level rather than in the second-floor windows. The distances would be different, and the angles would change, but she had practiced these calculations countless times. Her father had taught her to always think several moves ahead, like playing chess with a rifle. As she watched, several soldiers emerged from the rear of the building, clearly checking to ensure the alley was secure. They moved carefully, weapons ready, scanning the surrounding buildings and the mountainside. Elena could see their tension even from her distant position. They knew a deadly sniper was watching them, and every movement carried the risk of death. Then Elena saw him. General Rossi appeared briefly in the rear doorway, his distinctive uniform and slight limp making him recognizable even at distance. He was being escorted by several soldiers who were clearly trying to shield him with their bodies. But even with protection, Elena could see that there would be a moment when he would have to cross the open alley to reach the waiting vehicle. Elena calculated the new distance at approximately 680 meters. The angle was different now, shooting more downward than before, and she would have to account for the gravitational drop of the bullet over that distance. The wind had remained steady from the west, so her previous calculations still applied. Rossi was taking his time, clearly aware that crossing the open space would expose him to sniper fire. Elena could see him talking to his escorts, probably planning their movement to minimize his exposure. But Elena knew that no matter how carefully they planned, there would be a moment when he would be vulnerable. The general appeared again in the doorway, and Elena could see him preparing to move. His escorts had positioned themselves to provide maximum cover, but physics and geometry worked in Elena's favor. From her elevated position, she would have a clear shot regardless of how his men positioned themselves. Rossi began his dash across the alley, moving faster than Elena had expected despite his limp. But she had anticipated this possibility and had already calculated where he would be at each moment of his crossing. Her father had taught her to shoot at where the target was going to be, not where it was. The third shot came 26 minutes after the first, as General Rossi was approximately halfway across the alley. Elena's bullet struck him in the chest, and he stumbled and fell before reaching the safety of the waiting vehicle. His escorts immediately dragged him behind cover, but Elena could see from their frantic movements that the wound was serious. Within minutes, Elena could see a military ambulance racing through the village square. Medical personnel rushed to where Rossi had fallen, and she watched through her scope as they worked frantically to save him. But even from her distant position, she could tell that her shot had been accurate and devastating. Elena carefully and quietly gathered her equipment, knowing that enemy forces would now be mobilizing to hunt for her. She had completed her mission with 3 shots fired and 3 targets eliminated. The 3 generals who had planned to extend the war with their winter offensive would never implement their plans. History had just changed course, 1 bullet at a time. The third shot had barely stopped echoing through the valley when Elena began her carefully planned escape. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years hunting in these mountains, each step calculated to avoid loose stones or breaking twigs. The enemy would be organizing search parties within minutes, and every second ahead could mean the difference between escape and capture. Elena wrapped her rifle in the camouflage cloth and secured it to her back with practiced movements. She had rehearsed this evacuation route dozens of times during the past week, memorizing every rock outcropping, every possible hiding place, every stream that could mask her footprints. The path she chose wound through the densest part of the forest, where the canopy would hide her from any aircraft that might be deployed in the search. Behind her, the village had erupted into chaos. She could hear vehicles starting, orders being shouted, and the sounds of large numbers of troops mobilizing. Through the trees, Elena caught glimpses of soldiers spreading out from the village in all directions, beginning their hunt for the sniper who had just eliminated 3 of their most important commanders in less than half an hour. Major Klaus Weber had arrived in the village just as the medical team was loading General Rossi into the ambulance. Weber was a specialist in counter-sniper operations, called in from headquarters when reports of the first shooting reached command. He was a tall, lean man with cold gray eyes and a reputation for relentless pursuit of his targets. He had hunted snipers in 3 different theaters of war and had never failed to eliminate his target. Weber surveyed the scene with professional detachment. 3 shots, 3 hits, fired from an elevated position at considerable distance. The precision suggested a highly skilled marksman with extensive training or natural talent. The timing between shots indicated careful planning and exceptional nerve under pressure. This was not a lucky amateur, but a dangerous professional. The major began his investigation by examining the bullet trajectories. The angles of the shots, combined with the damage patterns, gave him a good indication of the sniper's general location. He called for a map of the surrounding terrain and began marking possible firing positions. His experience told him that the sniper had chosen a location with good visibility, multiple escape routes, and natural camouflage. Elena, meanwhile, was making steady progress along her escape route. She moved in a pattern her father had taught her during hunting trips, traveling in a zigzag course that would make it difficult for tracking dogs to follow her scent. Every few hundred meters, she would stop and listen, checking for sounds of pursuit. So far, the search seemed to be concentrated in the immediate area around the village, but Elena knew that would change soon. The first helicopter appeared over the valley about 30 minutes after Elena had begun her escape. She heard the distinctive sound of rotor blades and immediately sought cover under a thick stand of pine trees. The aircraft was flying a search pattern, moving slowly back and forth across the mountainside. Elena pressed herself against the trunk of a large tree and remained perfectly still as the helicopter passed overhead. Major Weber had commandeered the helicopter search and was personally directing the operation from the ground. He had divided the search area into sectors and was systematically checking each one. His teams were equipped with thermal imaging devices that could detect body heat even through forest cover. But Weber also knew that an experienced sniper would be aware of such technology and would have methods to counter it. Elena had indeed prepared for thermal detection. During her week of preparation, she had noticed the helicopter patrols and had suspected they might have advanced detection equipment. She carried a special blanket designed to block thermal signatures, and when the helicopter approached her hiding spot, she quickly covered herself and lay flat against the cold ground. The helicopter hovered directly above her position for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Elena could hear the pilot talking on the radio, reporting his findings to ground control. Through the thin fabric of her thermal blanket, she could see the shadow of the aircraft moving overhead. She controlled her breathing and remained absolutely motionless, knowing that any movement might be detected. Eventually, the helicopter moved on to search other areas. Elena waited another 10 minutes before carefully emerging from her hiding place. The aircraft was now visible in the distance, checking a different section of the mountainside. She resumed her movement, but now she knew that she was being hunted by professionals with sophisticated equipment. The escape route Elena had planned took her through an area of the forest that was particularly difficult to navigate. Fallen trees created natural obstacles that would slow down any pursuing soldiers, and a series of small streams provided opportunities to mask her tracks. She had cached supplies at several points along the route during her week of preparation, including food, ammunition, and equipment for an extended evasion. By late afternoon, Elena had covered approximately 8 kilometers from her original shooting position. She was now in an area of the forest that she knew better than most people, having hunted here with her father since childhood. Every tree, every rock formation, every animal trail was familiar to her. This knowledge would be crucial in the days to come, as the search intensified. Major Weber had established his command post in the village and was coordinating the search operation with methodical precision. He had deployed over 200 soldiers in a systematic grid pattern, each team equipped with radio communication and thermal detection equipment. Tracking dogs had been brought in to follow any scent trails, and additional helicopters were being transferred from other sectors to assist in the search. But Weber was also aware that he was dealing with someone who knew the local terrain intimately. The precision of the shots and the apparent ease of the escape suggested a local person with extensive knowledge of the area. He began interviewing villagers, looking for information about anyone in the region who might have the skills necessary to make such shots. The interviews revealed several interesting facts. Multiple villagers mentioned Elena Petrov, a young woman known for her exceptional hunting abilities. Her father had been famous in the region for his marksmanship, and Elena had inherited both his skills and his rifle. But when Weber's men went to investigate Elena's family home, they found it abandoned. The house showed signs of hasty departure, with some personal items missing, but others left behind. Weber studied the information about Elena with growing interest. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and known to spend weeks at a time in the mountains hunting alone. Local hunters respected her skills and often asked her advice about tracking game. Her father had died 2 years earlier, leaving her alone in the world with no close family ties. Everything about her profile suggested someone who could have planned and executed the sniper attack. As night fell, Elena reached her first planned shelter, a small cave hidden behind a waterfall about 15 kilometers from the village. She had discovered this cave during a hunting trip several years earlier and had always remembered it as the perfect hiding place. The sound of the waterfall would mask any noise she made, and the cave was invisible from more than 50 meters away. Elena carefully checked the cave before entering, making sure no animals had taken up residence since her last visit. The cave was dry and spacious enough for her to stand upright in most areas. She had cached supplies here during her preparation week, including a sleeping bag, dried food, and extra ammunition for her rifle. As she settled in for the night, Elena allowed herself to think about what she had accomplished. 3 shots had eliminated 3 of the enemy's most effective generals. Intelligence reports suggested that the planned winter offensive involved over 50,000 troops and would have extended the war by months or even years. By eliminating the generals responsible for planning and coordinating the offensive, Elena had potentially saved thousands of lives and shortened the conflict significantly. But Elena also knew that her actions would have consequences. The enemy would now devote substantial resources to hunting her down. Major Weber's reputation suggested that he would not give up easily, and she could expect the search to continue for weeks or even months. She would have to remain hidden while also finding ways to continue her resistance activities. The sound of helicopters passing overhead reminded Elena that the hunt was far from over. She could hear them flying search patterns even in the darkness, probably using infrared equipment to scan for heat signatures. Elena pulled her thermal blanket around herself and settled deeper into the cave, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. Major Weber was also spending a sleepless night, studying maps and intelligence reports in his temporary command post. He had narrowed the search area based on the trajectory analysis and was confident that the sniper was still somewhere in the surrounding mountains. His thermal imaging flights had detected several possible heat signatures, but investigation had revealed them to be wildlife or local hunters who could account for their presence. Weber was particularly interested in Elena Petrov. Everything about her background suggested that she could be his target. The timing of her disappearance, combined with her known skills and local knowledge, made her the primary suspect. He had issued orders to focus the search on areas where someone with her hunting experience would be most likely to hide. As dawn approached, Weber prepared for the next phase of his operation. He would expand the search area and begin using more aggressive tactics. Tracking dogs would be deployed in areas where scent trails had been detected, and his teams would begin checking every possible hiding place systematically. Weber was confident that within a few days, he would have Elena Petrov in custody or dead. But Elena had advantages that Weber might not fully appreciate. She knew these mountains better than anyone, and she had spent years developing the patience and skills necessary to survive in the wilderness for extended periods. The hunt had begun, but Elena was ready for whatever came next. Elena had been hidden in the waterfall cave for 3 days when she heard the dogs. The distant barking carried through the forest, still far away, but definitely getting closer. She gathered her equipment quickly, but calmly, having prepared for this moment since she first heard the helicopters on the night of her escape. The thermal blanket went into her pack, the rifle was secured to her back, and within minutes, she was moving deeper into the mountain wilderness. Major Weber had finally received the tracking dogs he had requested from headquarters. These were not ordinary search dogs, but specially trained animals capable of following scent trails that were days old. Weber had studied Elena's probable escape routes and had started the dogs at several points where his analysis suggested she might have passed. The breakthrough had come when one of the dog teams picked up a strong scent trail near a stream about 6 kilometers from the original shooting position. Elena moved through the forest, using every technique her father had taught her about evading pursuit. She walked in streams whenever possible to eliminate her scent trail, doubled back on her own path to confuse trackers, and used natural obstacles like fallen trees and rocky areas where footprints would be difficult to follow. But she could hear that the dogs were persistent, and their handlers were experienced in tracking human prey through difficult terrain. The terrain Elena was moving through was some of the most challenging in the entire mountain range. Steep slopes covered with loose rock made every step potentially dangerous, and the dense undergrowth concealed hidden ravines and sudden drop-offs. But Elena knew this area intimately from years of hunting expeditions. She could navigate safely through areas that would slow down or stop her pursuers. Weber was coordinating the chase from a helicopter, using radio communication to direct his ground teams toward areas where the dogs had detected strong scent trails. He had studied maps of Elena's likely route and had positioned blocking forces at strategic points where the terrain would force her to follow predictable paths. His plan was to slowly tighten the circle around her until she had no choice but to surrender or fight. But Elena had anticipated this strategy. During her years of hunting in these mountains, she had discovered routes that did not appear on any military map. Ancient animal trails and paths used by local hunters for generations provided alternatives to the obvious routes that Weber's forces would be watching. Elena began following one of these hidden paths, moving deeper into the wilderness toward areas where few people ever ventured. The pursuit continued for 2 more days. Elena could hear helicopters passing overhead regularly, and she occasionally caught glimpses of search teams moving through the forest below her position. The dogs had lost her scent trail several times, but the handlers always managed to pick it up again after systematic searching. Elena realized that Weber was not going to give up easily, and she needed a new strategy. On the 5th night after the shooting, Elena made a decision that would change the nature of the chase. Instead of continuing to run, she decided to turn and fight. She had been trained as a resistance fighter, not just as a sniper, and she knew that sometimes the best defense was offense. Elena began planning an ambush that would demonstrate to Weber and his forces that hunting her carried serious risks. Elena chose her ambush site carefully, selecting a narrow canyon where the terrain would force Weber's search teams to travel in single file along a predictable path. She had noticed during the past few days that the search teams followed certain patterns in their movement, checking potential hiding places systematically, but always returning to established trails when moving between areas. The canyon Elena selected was about 12 kilometers from her waterfall cave, in an area where 3 different animal trails converged. She had hunted here many times with her father and knew that any tracking team following the scent trails would have to pass through this location. The high walls of the canyon provided excellent concealment for a sniper, and multiple escape routes led away from the site through terrain that would be difficult for pursuit teams to follow. Elena spent an entire day preparing her ambush position. She moved rocks to create a better shooting rest, clear vegetation that might interfere with her aim, and established 3 different firing positions so she could engage targets from multiple angles. She also prepared escape routes from each position, timing how long it would take to move from one location to another. Major Weber's teams were indeed following the pattern Elena had predicted. The dog handlers had lost her scent at the stream crossing, but Weber's systematic search strategy had identified the canyon as a high-probability location for finding the trail again. He assigned his most experienced tracking team to check the area, led by Sergeant Hans Mueller, a veteran woodsman with extensive experience in hunting fugitives through wilderness terrain. Mueller's team consisted of 4 soldiers plus 2 dog handlers with their animals. They approached the canyon in standard formation, with point men checking for signs of recent passage while the dog handlers worked to pick up any scent trails. Mueller himself was an experienced tracker who had pursued enemies through forests in 3 different countries, and he was confident that they would either find Elena or clear the area systematically. Elena watched the team approach through her rifle scope. She could see Mueller directing his men, pointing out areas to be searched and establishing fields of fire to cover the team as they moved. The professionalism of the team was evident in their movement and positioning, but Elena noticed that they were following predictable patterns that she could exploit. The first shot came when Mueller's team was approximately halfway through the canyon. Elena had waited until they were committed to the route and could not easily retreat or find cover. She aimed for Mueller himself, recognizing from his behavior and equipment that he was the team leader. The shot was from approximately 400 meters, closer than her shots at the generals, but still requiring precision and careful calculation. Mueller dropped instantly, struck in the chest by Elena's bullet. The reaction of his team was immediate and professional, with the soldiers taking cover and attempting to locate Elena's firing position. But Elena had already moved to her second position, using routes she had prepared earlier. By the time the soldiers were ready to return fire, she was shooting at them from a completely different angle. Elena's second shot eliminated one of the dog handlers, disrupting the team's ability to track her effectively. Without the dogs, finding her in the vast wilderness would be much more difficult. The remaining soldiers were now focused entirely on survival rather than pursuit, calling for backup and attempting to evacuate their casualties. Weber received a radio call about the ambush while he was studying maps at his command post. Mueller's panicked voice reported that they were under sniper attack and needed immediate extraction. 2 men were down, and the team was pinned down in the canyon with no clear escape route. Weber immediately dispatched helicopter support, but he knew that Elena had turned the tables on his pursuit operation. Elena fired 3 more shots during the 15 minutes it took for the helicopter to arrive, keeping the surviving soldiers pinned down and preventing them from mounting any effective counterattack. She aimed carefully to wound rather than kill, wanting to send a message that pursuing her was dangerous, but not wanting to escalate the conflict unnecessarily. Each shot demonstrated her control of the situation and her ability to eliminate targets at will. When the rescue helicopter arrived, Elena was already gone. The soldiers who had been hunting her were now the ones who needed rescuing, and the psychological impact of the ambush would affect every subsequent search operation. Weber's teams would now know that they were not just hunting Elena, but that she was also hunting them. The evacuation of Mueller's team required 2 helicopters and diverted significant resources from the search operation. Elena had wounded 3 soldiers and killed 1, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that Weber's systematic approach was vulnerable to counterattack. The hunter had become the hunted, and the dynamics of the chase had fundamentally changed. Weber studied the reports from the ambush with professional respect for his opponent. Elena had chosen her position perfectly, executed her attack with precision, and escaped without being detected. She had also shown restraint by wounding rather than killing when possible, suggesting tactical sophistication rather than simple bloodthirsty revenge. Weber realized he was dealing with an opponent who was not just skilled, but also intelligent and strategic. Elena, meanwhile, had moved to a new hiding place deep in the mountains, farther from the original search area than Weber's teams had yet penetrated. She knew that the ambush would intensify the hunt for her, but she had also proven that she could fight back effectively. The psychological advantage had shifted in her favor, and Weber's teams would now be more cautious and less aggressive in their pursuit. The cat and mouse game in the mountains was far from over, but Elena had demonstrated that she was not just prey to be hunted. She was a dangerous opponent who could strike back at any time and place of her choosing. The war of nerves had begun, and Elena intended to use every advantage or knowledge of the terrain and her sniper skills could provide. Weber would have to reconsider his strategy, knowing that his teams were now at risk every time they ventured into Elena's territory. The mountains that had been Elena's hunting ground since childhood had now become her fortress, and she intended to defend it with deadly effectiveness. Winter was approaching when Major Weber finally received orders to end the search for Elena Petrov. 3 months had passed since the shooting of the 3 generals, and the resources devoted to hunting one sniper were needed elsewhere as the war entered a new phase. Elena had successfully evaded capture despite the largest manhunt in the region's history, and her actions had already achieved their strategic purpose. The winter offensive that the 3 generals had been planning never happened. Without von Stoltz's tactical expertise, Volkov's artillery coordination, and Rossi's special forces innovations, the enemy command structure in the region had been thrown into chaos. Replacement commanders had been appointed, but they lacked the experience and local knowledge of their predecessors. The missed opportunity to launch a major offensive during favorable weather conditions had strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Elena had spent the autumn months moving through the mountains like a ghost, occasionally striking at small enemy patrols, but mostly remaining hidden. She had established a network of supply caches throughout her territory, using caves and hidden shelters to store food, ammunition, and equipment. Local resistance fighters had helped her by leaving supplies at predetermined locations, though they never made direct contact to avoid compromising her security. The legend of the Ghost of the Mountains had spread throughout both armies. Enemy soldiers spoke in whispers about the sniper, who could kill from impossible distances and then disappear without a trace. Allied forces told stories about Elena's 3 perfect shots that had changed the course of the war. The truth of her actions had been embellished through retelling, but the core facts remained. One woman with a rifle had eliminated 3 generals and then successfully evaded the largest manhunt of the war. Weber had come to respect his opponent during their months of cat and mouse through the wilderness. Elena had outmaneuvered his teams repeatedly, demonstrating not just shooting skills, but also tactical intelligence and wilderness survival abilities that impressed even experienced soldiers. She had wounded or killed 12 of his men during various encounters, always striking from unexpected positions and escaping before effective countermeasures could be deployed. The psychological impact of Elena's actions extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Enemy morale in the region had been significantly affected by the knowledge that their commanders could be eliminated at any moment by an unseen sniper. Supply convoys required heavier escorts, and important meetings had to be held in underground bunkers or locations far from the fighting. The resources devoted to protection and counter-sniper operations reduced the effectiveness of regular military operations. Elena's story had also inspired resistance fighters throughout the occupied territories. Reports of her success had spread through underground networks, and other snipers began attempting similar operations. The enemy command found itself dealing with multiple sniper threats, requiring them to disperse their counter-sniper resources and reducing the effectiveness of their response to any individual threat. As winter settled over the mountains, Elena established herself in a deep cave system that she had discovered during one of her evasion movements. The caves provided protection from the weather and concealment from thermal detection equipment. She had cached enough supplies to survive the entire winter without exposure, and the cave system connected to underground passages that would allow her to move several kilometers without appearing on the surface. The war itself was entering its final phase. The strategic disruption caused by Elena's elimination of the 3 generals had contributed to larger developments that were bringing the conflict toward its conclusion. The missed winter offensive had allowed Allied forces to consolidate their positions and prepare for their own spring campaign. Intelligence reports suggested that the enemy's ability to continue the war was becoming increasingly limited. Major Weber's final report on the Elena Petrov case became required reading at sniper and counter-sniper schools for years afterward. His analysis of her tactics, her use of terrain, and her psychological warfare techniques was studied by military professionals who recognized her innovations in wilderness combat. Weber concluded that Elena represented a new type of warfare, combining traditional marksmanship skills with modern guerrilla tactics and psychological operations. Elena's rifle, the one her father had left her and which she had modified for long-range precision shooting, became almost legendary among resistance fighters. The weapon that had fired the 3 shots heard around the world was said to possess supernatural accuracy, though military analysts recognized that the accuracy came from the skill of the person using it rather than any special properties of the rifle itself. Spring brought news that the war was indeed ending. Peace negotiations had begun, and while fighting continued in some areas, the overall trajectory was toward conclusion of the conflict. Elena emerged from her winter hiding place to find that the world had changed. The enemy forces that had hunted her were being withdrawn or repositioned, and the civilian population was beginning to return to their homes. Victor, the resistance leader who had originally recruited Elena for the mission against the 3 generals, found her in early April. He brought news of the war's progress and official recognition from the Allied command of Elena's contribution to the war effort. Her 3 shots had been credited with disrupting enemy plans sufficiently to shorten the war by months and save thousands of lives. But Elena found that fame was more difficult to handle than the months of being hunted. She preferred the solitude of the mountains to the attention that came with being recognized as a war hero. Military officials wanted to interview her about her tactics, journalists wanted to tell her story, and communities wanted to honor her as a liberating hero. Elena accepted some of these obligations out of duty, but she always returned to the mountains where she felt most at home. The three enemy generals Elena had eliminated were eventually recognized by military historians as among the most capable commanders of their generation. Von Stoltz's tactical innovations were studied in military academies. Volkov's artillery techniques were adopted by multiple armies, and Rossi's special operations methods influenced military doctrine for decades. The fact that one person with one rifle had eliminated all three in less than 30 minutes demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most protected and experienced military leaders. Elena's story became the subject of books, films, and academic studies. Military analysts debated whether her success was due primarily to exceptional marksmanship, careful planning, or simple luck. Historians argued about the strategic impact of her actions and whether the war would have ended differently without her intervention. But for Elena herself, the important thing was that she had done what needed to be done when it needed to be done. Years later, Elena still lived in the mountains where she had grown up, where she had learned to shoot with her father, and where she had conducted the most important mission of her life. She occasionally guided hunters or hikers through the wilderness, sharing her knowledge of the terrain and wildlife. Few of her clients knew that their quiet guide was the legendary sniper whose 3 shots had helped change the course of history. The rifle that had fired those 3 historic shots was eventually donated to a military museum, where it was displayed with a simple plaque describing Elena's mission. Visitors could see the weapon and read about the young woman who had used it to eliminate 3 enemy generals from over 750 meters away. But the true legacy of Elena's actions was not in museums, but in the lives that had been saved and the war that had been shortened by her courage and skill. Elena Petrov had entered the war as an unknown village hunter and emerged as one of history's most celebrated snipers. 3 shots fired on one morning had established her legend and demonstrated that in warfare, individual actions could have strategic consequences far beyond their immediate tactical impact. The Ghost of the Mountains had proven that sometimes one person in the right place at the right time with the right skills could indeed change the course of history.